All right, I think we are at about time, so why don't we get our panel kicked off. Welcome. This is a panel looking at will trust issues with face recognition technology undermine advances in identity verification. So I think what we want to look at today, if you looked at the session description, we talked about the last 2 years have seen a flurry of attention focused on facial recognition technology among the press, among advocates, among policymakers, with increasing concern focused on the idea that this technology is inherently biased and thus its use, any use of it, is going to be leading to inequitable outcomes. And I think while most of the attention has been focused on surveillance applications of face biometrics, some efforts have also focused on identity verification use cases, particularly new tools like what people tend to call selfie match, that are becoming more common in the remote identity proofing space. And with this, there's been a lot of talk and some confusion among the press and policymakers and activists around the different ways face biometrics are used, some of it accidental, but I think some of it a little bit intentional. So this panel is going to explore some of the real and perceived issues with face recognition, as well as potential paths industry and government might be able to take to address some of the concerns about bias and actually ensure that the technology is used in a way that benefits everybody. My name is Jeremy Grant. I'll be your moderator today and also have some opening slides to set the stage. I'm a managing director in Venable's privacy and cybersecurity practice. I also serve as the coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition. We've got a great panel today, but not as great as I hoped it would be. Stephanie Schuckers, who's a professor at Clarkson University and the director of CIDR, the Center for Identity Technology Research, had her flight canceled last night with some thunderstorms on the East Coast. And I'm really sorry she's not here, both just because she's an awesome perspective to have, but also I don't want to be, how would I say it, diminishing some of the concerns that are quite real, when it comes to bias in the technology. And while the two panelists who are here, I think, are both awesome and are going to have great perspective, they both do work for vendors, and I was really excited to have Stephanie as more of an independent academic voice talking as well. But we have I've asked Teresa and Jordan to introduce themselves when we get started in the panel. But Teresa Wu is VP of Innovation and Client Engagement at IDEMIA. Jordan Burris is Senior Director of Product Market Strategy for the public sector at Socure. I think we're still going to have a good discussion today, but I did want to note we are missing, I think, an important perspective without Stephanie here. So just in terms of a few slides to set the stage, a part of what we're focusing on here is really face as it's being used in the remote identity proofing market. And I think we've had an evolution over the last few years where, the state of the market in 2017 was knowledge-based verification. Can you answer 4 questions about yourself? And if so, it proves you actually are that person, which, for those who are able to see the slides, the Are You Rob Base questionnaire to me is still the best way to really capture the general absurdity of knowledge-based verification solutions and some of their problems. Question 3 is the trick one. Are you internationally known? No, if you're familiar with the song It Takes Two by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, which you all should be. Thank you. So I think today we've seen a lot of that replaced. So, that what we're seeing more and more, certainly if you walk around the show floor, is, a solution that's focused on, hey, take a picture of your driver's license or passport, take a picture of you to try and match the photo on the document, to you. Often that's augmented with things like geolocation, other device information that they're able to glean from it, all of it analyzed with artificial intelligence, in many cases behind the scenes, or sometimes humans, to try and come up with an answer to the question, are you who you really claim to be? And taking a step back, with face recognition, I think the technology, particularly in some of its applications around law enforcement and surveillance, has had some real problems. And so these are just some of the headlines from the past few years. First, a New Jersey man who was accused of shoplifting and trying to hit an officer with the car. It was, I think, Clearview AI who, he was misidentified, and suddenly had somebody who was arrested who had nothing to do with the incident that had happened. Likewise, this happened back where I'm from in the suburbs of Detroit, where somebody from Farmington Hills, which is the town next to where I grew up back in Michigan, was arrested for robbing a Shinola watch store that he had never robbed, and was arrested kind of violently in front of his children. Whoops, that's my microphone. Based on a awful mismatch. And one of the things that we've been seeing is this seems to be happening more often than not when you do see it to people of color, which is kind of a problem. So with this, we start to see policymakers and activists talking about this. So, senators like Ed Markey called the use of face recognition technology a threat to black communities, focusing particularly on Clearview, which I think is a company that's been really pushing boundaries here in ways that other companies have not been willing to. Article in Nature magazine, is face recognition too biased to be let loose? And then this, sort of trickled over into the identity verification space when the IRS earlier this year announced plans to start using the selfie match applications of the technology as a way to try and figure out who the heck's who in order to get information, out of the IRS about, your taxes, which, has a whole bunch of important personal information. The condemnation of this was swift and furious, I think in part because there's not a single politician who sees any political downside in bashing the IRS, but also because it raised some real questions around, wait, we're doing what? And we have to do what here with the company? Articles popping up in places like The Atlantic saying the IRS needs to stop, and then they, haven't totally stopped, but it's no longer mandatory. But a lot of what I saw during the articles that were popping up and, comments that were being made from policymakers. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm, former Senate staffer, still active, quite a bit in, cybersecurity and identity policy. Was a whole bunch of confusion around what are we talking about here? And so, this was a slide I made at the time to try and educate some friends who were Senate staffers that I called 4 flavors of face. Although Stephanie, who's not here, pointed out there's actually 5. There's a forensics application that probably sits somewhere between biometric deduplication and surveillance. But, face biometrics are used from everything from Face ID, which is a one-to-one match where biometrics never leave the phone. There's no central database. If you're falsely matched, the consequences are the imposter gets into your phone. If it doesn't work, you go back to a password. The selfie match tools aren't, too far from that, but it does involve, taking the biometrics off your phone in most cases. So, a selfie's, matched against the photo that is extracted by a smartphone picture on your phone. Photos are captured voluntarily as part of a process to prove who you are, to try and get access to an online service where you probably couldn't get access to that service because the trust model is such that they're not going to offer it online unless they know who you are. The false match consequences are an imposter opens account in your name, and if it doesn't work, if it's inaccurate for bias or other concerns, basically means you have to go to some sort of a fallback option. You can't open an account through the digital channel. One of the things we've seen is a video chat with a trusted agent. Then there's biometric deduplication, which has been used probably for, over 15 years now, maybe longer, by the State Department for passports and visas, by the DMV for driver's licenses, basically to make sure if I show up at the DMV one day as Jeremy Grant, and then the next week grow an awesome mustache, which I can do in just a week, and come back and say I'm Jim Bob Grant, and then shave my head and come in as Johnny Grant the next week, you can use that to try and figure out if somebody's getting multiple credentials under different names who's really the same person. Again, here photos are captured voluntarily. They're following ISO standards. You're using very high quality cameras. The consequences of a false match, if you're confused with somebody else, is you're flagged for further review. And then if it doesn't catch you, basically means an imposter could get a second ID under a different name. And then surveillance, which is where I think a lot of the real focus has been on the policy side, is when you're just walking down the street and cameras are scanning you. It's not voluntary. It's as I wrote, creepy as fuck, sorry. Photos are captured from odd angles and irregular equipment that may skew results and misidentify people, and the algorithms are frequently going to provide biased results in that case. And the false match consequences are pretty severe. You might be falsely arrested. If it doesn't match you, well, maybe somebody who is of interest isn't identified. And I think the forensics thing in the middle is, looking into, something that happened perhaps after the fact, looking at video camera. Some of those examples of where people were falsely arrested before also fall into a lot of, the forensics issues. So there are, some concerns there. But I think the whole point of laying this out is to point out face biometrics is not one thing, it's several. And the applications in terms of how it's used and the policy issues and the concerns around bias, inequity, and inclusion are really different when you're talking about the consequences being you're falsely arrested and accused of a crime versus, you can't do something online as easily as you'd like to. Not to say that that's not a problem, but it's different sorts of things. So what's been really interesting is what's been said. And I used to work at NIST as leading the digital identity group there. NIST has done some really interesting work. They published a big study in 2019 looking at bias issues and face recognition algorithms. And one of the things I wanted to do today, just to set the stage, is sort of talk about what people are saying, and then we'll actually talk about what NIST has said, because it hasn't necessarily been the same thing. So in a 2019 NIST study, these are all quotes from articles over the last few months, They looked at 189 face recognition algorithms. The majority were biased. Specifically, they were less accurate on people from racial and ethnic minorities. Somebody else says this technology poses unique threats to black communities, other communities of color, and immigrant communities. An analysis of face recognition tools conducted by NIST found that black, brown, and Asian individuals were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white male faces. Face recognition technology has been found to be biased, have a disproportionate impact of people of color and other marginalized communities, and the use of the technology has serious implications for privacy and civil liberties. And then things start to escalate a little bit. Biometrics have no place being used by agencies that provide people with basic services. There is no way that face recognition or other tools that collect biometric data can be used in a safe manner. We liken it to nuclear weapons. Too dangerous and shouldn't be used at all. Face recognition technology is racist from how it was built to how it is used. So a lot of big statements. So here's what NIST actually said in 2019. They said for one-to-one matching, the team did see higher rates of false positives for Asian and African American faces relative to the images of Caucasians. The differentials range from a factor of 10 times to 100 times. So yeah, I think it's important to talk about the magnitude of things and the implications in terms of up to 100 times versus 10 to 100. Well, we actually want to talk about statistically, what do some of those things mean at scale? They also point out not every algorithm has these problems, and those that are the most accurate also rank among the most equitable. They talk about the false negative error rates, where there's a match that varies strongly by algorithm from less than 1% to above 10%. And they said, again, for the more accurate algorithms, the false negative rates are usually low, with average demographic differentials being necessarily smaller still. And finally, if you're dealing with high-quality photos, the error rates are very low, and the measurement of false negative differentials across demographics is actually quite difficult. So there's a more nuanced story that's here. And I think one of the issues, I've had, certainly with folks in this room, conversations with a lot of you around how to actually objectively discuss this very detailed research on bias in some fake algorithms versus just jump to the conclusion that the use of anything is just blatantly racist. And I think we've seen a lot of cocaine Elmo face planting in some parts of the community on this topic. And so I think one reason we wanted to have this panel today was really to talk about, let's actually dig into the science and where are there problems and where are there things where we can perhaps reliably or safely use the technology, ask if we can, and then talk about other things from a policy perspective, from a NIST measurement and evaluation perspective. What are some of the things that we can do about it? So I've talked too much. So now, finally, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa and then to Jordan to introduce yourselves and provide some opening thoughts. And then we'll have some moderated questions and maybe time for Q&A.
Good morning. That's great intro. Level set. That's like one of the best 101 for this topic I have seen. My name is Teresa Wu. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Client Engagement for IDEMIA in North America. One of my main role is technology thought leadership out here to explain how the tech works and should work and understand and appreciate it, and also engage with the customer and the industry on topic like this. So I'm very happy to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Jordan Burris, and I'm a Senior Director for Product Market Strategy for Socure's public sector business. My role really with the company is helping to meet with agency leaders to help understand their pain points and challenges, but then also helping to evangelize really what are forward-leaning concepts related to equity and inclusion for a number of elements, to include identity. In a prior life, prior to joining Socure, I actually served in the White House Office of the Federal CIO as Chief of Staff, and one of the many things that were under my purview at the time was identity policy. And so for a number of years, I've been involved in this space and have seen kind of the ebb and flow that has been this debate related to the usage of biometrics, along with the growth and evolution, if you will, of the standards and policies on this. So definitely looking forward to getting into many of the things that are good and some things that may need to change with our approach.
So let me start with an opening question. I don't know who wants to take it. You got the microphone, so you might.
Oh, I'm happy to.
Should there be trust issues with using face technology in remote identity verification?
So when it comes to the technology itself, I would say it's a lot of it comes down to how it is rolled out, how it is deployed, whether or not there's transparency in practices associated with it, and then whether or not you're actually doing deep testing around the technology in and of itself and how it's used. The problem that we have and what we saw play out very recently was that technology was used and no one knew why it was being deployed. There was lack of transparency, and when you even asked the question as to what was happening, there was an overconflation about the type of technology being used, right? Whether or not you were using 1-to-1 versus 1-to-N, and that in some cases help, dilute the message that's been going on with the value or the benefit that may be biometrics in particular, and that causes a rift, if you will, with ultimately public trust. And if you're talking in particular of like how that impacts will be the public sector in particular, public trust is paramount. And so when you have non-transparent practices and you're doing things that serve to erode that trust, you're ultimately going to have the issue, which leads us back into this classic debate.
I would say it's normal to have trust issues, like any other tech, especially now the facial recognition has been AI powered. So I would say trust but verified. And that's what all the NIST testing is for. So it is to be expected to have trust issues. And that's why it has to be intentional when you deploy it, like Jordan said, to be methodical in deploying facial recognition programs. Have policy around it, socialization, outreach, have a like FAQ, be prepared. It's not just launching it. I always, a couple of years ago when I was here in Identityverse, when you talk to some of the IAM vendor, they think that biometric is just one token like OTP, and it's not. Biometric come with luggage. So it come with trust issue, and we all have, as an ecosystem, we have to deal with it.
Yeah. Let me ask you, I don't think I told you I was going to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it. So the NIST studies that they've done, looking at accuracy and bias in face, they tested 189 vendors, and it's a loaded question, which is, are all of the algorithms that they're testing coming from the same place? And by that I mean, are they all like companies that are out there selling biometrics, or are some of these being thrown in for other purposes?
Great questions. So that was 2019. Since 2019, they have evaluated even more. So I think the last count I have in 1-to-1 was like close to almost 400 algorithms. And then in 1-to-N was like 289. It was every year, just this year alone, the first quarter, that we seen like 60 algorithms get evaluated. So it's definitely a very prolific space. And no, it's not all the same places. They are algorithm provider from all around the world, from U.S. to Western countries, from universities to companies, to some newer players that with AI, sort of like there's all kind of different algorithm. Of course, they are not surprising. The top performer algorithm actually is from a company from China. So yes, it's a diversity of algorithm provider, and looking into who is providing the algorithm and how they are developing is actually key toward that trust issues.
Mm-hmm. And are some of them not even companies, but sometimes might be like postdocs researching that just want to throw it in to see how well they compete against the major players?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask when we talk about bias is I think one of the things that's been missing from this discussion is what are the alternatives? And when I look at, to be clear, I want to say up front, I think so the dock-off and selfie match is not necessarily the end state of where we want to go with all of this. And depending on the product, some of them do have accuracy issues. The flip side is, going back to the first slide I had, it's replaced knowledge-based verification, which had some real issues with both accuracy as well as equity and inclusion. And somebody made a point to me at the start of this that when we're talking about this discussion, it's got to be relative to what's the alternative. So for how would I say, if I'm a 19-year-old African American woman who has a thin or non-existent credit history, there's no way the knowledge-based systems are going to be able to clear somebody. But if I happen to have a driver's license, if I can take a picture of that license with a smartphone that I have and then take a selfie, I might now have a path to prove who I am online that didn't exist before. How do each of you, and Jordan, I'd love to get your perspective, because I know you're looking at a lot of different things in identity verification and different pathways for different types of people and sort of wherever they may be coming from. How do we need to look at, as we talk about banning one application, potential unintended consequences?
Yeah, unfortunately, when you try to take the throw everything out approach, you end up opening yourself up to what would be the prevalence of more attacks, because you're really minimizing the controls that are in place to help safeguard against what we would see today. Unfortunately, when it comes to this topic of like what happens when you get rid of biometrics, we almost effectively start to recreate the notion that, especially biometrics that are used in a remote proofing process, you create the notion that you have to come back in person, right? A lot of our earlier, as human society, ways of verifying each other were based on in-person interactions, whether it's someone vouching for you within your community. At one point, tattoos and jewelry were used in order to do it. As we started to advance and evolve more, we then incorporated, to Jeremy's point, there was the proxy that was financial inclusion that became kind of the proxy towards your identity through the advent of the credit files in particular. And then biometrics were intended as a way in order to try to extend really what would be that in-person interaction and translate it over remote channels. Unfortunately, when you take the remote piece out of it, now you're forcing everyone to go back to either forcing folks to come back in person, forcing folks to potentially try to access technologies to talk to someone and evaluate themselves. When you have communities that are in rural areas, or those that just don't have access to the right types of technology, they're effectively left out of being able to participate, which then forces them back again to a manual process. There are ways in which you can verify individuals, and it's one of the things that we talk about with our organization now, with Socure, is that you can verify individuals passively by looking at the things that are present on their device without having to introduce additional friction to them. But is that nirvana? No, it's all based on a risk-based choice and decision ultimately. And so ultimately what we need to get to is really a harder conversation related to how much risk are we willing to accept? How are we moving towards more of a risk-based mindset when it comes to the things that we incorporate within our ecosystem? And then are we actually testing and evaluating what happens when we pull something back, when we have this knee-jerk reaction, and what the impact is to everyone in their everyday lives? Because I think very quickly with the IRS in particular, and if anyone is here from the IRS, I'm sorry, but y'all can yell at me later. Like there was the knee-jerk, we're just going to take everything out, we're not going to do it, and then very quickly they realized that they couldn't function in business, and so they decided to make it optional. And the reality is that they weren't going to change their standard, their level of rigor that was required. So they wanted to make the ability for folks to opt in order to use the biometrics, and then find other pathways for them to get through the process. And so again, a lot of work has to be done here. Nothing is perfect, but if we're starting to operate more on a risk management perspective, and then applying those principles of transparency up front, I think we can overcome a lot of what we see today.
So you talk about what's the alternative. I would say definitely the mistake to say, okay, let's not use facial recognition because we have the trust issues. Facial recognition is a very useful tool and I would say essential tools in today's way of identity verification, because every single identity document have pictures on it, and most of our identity issuance process have a face. So not using it is sort of like, you're one of your best tool from your toolbox. You want to take it out and make sure you're going to try to build a house without a hammer. Maybe you can. But the alternative would be looking at the ecosystem itself. What's a new way of creating a new credentials that you can verify in addition to facial recognition? So there are new technologies, new ways of authenticate a document that you don't need facial biometrics, encryptions, right? Some security features on those documents that are physical and digital that can transfer from the real world, physical world, to the digital world, and even to the metaverse, right? We're gonna have to think about how that's gonna work, because there's no facial recognition in the metaverse. So at some point, we do need an alternative, and we do also need to think that if that alternative come in, it's gonna change the way we issue documents, or the way we're gonna issue your credentials. And I think some of this talk today at the Identiverse is very relevant with the verified credentials, the way we do authentications, like what FIDO Alliance is proposing. I think there are alternatives out there, but it's gonna require different actor in the ecosystem to do it, to come with a viable alternative.
Thanks. One of the question I wanted to ask, so by the way, the title was loaded. The answer is yes. I think we're seeing this across the industry right now, which is in the wake of what happened earlier this year. There's a definite trust gap right now, and people don't really understand the technology. They're scared of it. Even if they do understand it, if you're in government, what's your incentive to lean forward and try to use this, given what you might have seen happen to your public sector peers? Are there things that we as industry could be doing to address some of the more outrageous statements that are out there where there's confusion around, all algorithms are biased versus some are and some actually probably work well? And beyond industry, is there a role that NIST can play here, given that so much of what's being pointed to is based on the work that they've done to date that is either being selectively quoted or in some cases just, how will I say it? It's confusing to digest all of it, and so that then leads to confusion in the marketplace. I'd love each of your perspectives in terms of, between government and industry, what do we do to at least get better facts out there to let people start to make good informed decisions?
I don't think we have enough time to say what we can do. I think there's so much we can still do in not just education. So when we always think about, let's educate the public or the policymakers, but I actually think we need to educate the industry folks from the ground up, from your support people, your deployment, from your engineer developers, from within the industry, that we need to educate our own our own industry people first to understand what's at stake. Because you can build it, that features, doesn't mean that it's gonna be good for the public. So I think that's the internal industry education we need to do. Make that as a visible priority. Like Jordan said about diversity, driving diversity inside a company first, having a diverse workforce, educate on this privacy, trust issue inside a company, so we be hyper aware of the impact to any kind of exclusion. It's not good for the business, it's not good for the people. Then I would say, number two, the technology since 2019, you look at the result in 2022 right now, the latest top 10 ranking algorithm, they are all submitted in the last year. Meaning that compared to the 2019, the error rate has reduced from 6 to 20 times. The AI have accelerated that improvement so fast that what we talk about the 19 algorithm, it's like decades ago, it was like generation ago. So keeping up with that, it's difficult. It's almost like those 19 results, it's not even relevant today, but it's what's stuck and we have to deal with it. I think also what NIST can do is really come up with beyond just population, ethics population. So what they did so far is man, woman, white, black, and then they did some, I would say, regional geographic population for ethnic group. They need to work with ISO, come up with a way of measuring what fairness is. I think fairness definition varies from one sector to another. So having a common criteria what a fair algorithm looks like and should be for everybody to thrive for. Just relying on specific high performer to say that, we have achieved fair state, it's not enough. I think we need that baseline so we can help the entire industry to race towards it.
Yeah, this is a loaded one. So, I mean, we can start with the perspective on education, right? I agree wholeheartedly. We need to do top to bottom. I think we need to get to common terminology. Stop trying to, I guess, one up from a marketing perspective and change terms every cycle in order to help sell ultimately across industry. I mean, that's incumbent on anyone. But we have to get to standard language in particular that can be applied here, so that way not only we're minimizing confusion within the industry, but also with the customers and those that we're engaging with. When it comes to the government, I'll take it from two lenses. One, from things I would recommend NIST try to pursue, and then just broader kind of the government ecosystem in particular. From the things NIST could potentially pursue, I would say that they've actually done a lot in terms of pushing their standards development to actually point towards industry bodies, and that's because they've been embedded with certain industry bodies. I know for those who look at encryption in particular, there was a work that went for FIPS 143 to point towards an ISO standard in particular. I would say in this space, they should just do the same. And basically start to push more towards industry standards. And the reason being is that I don't think they can actually keep pace with the evolution on a number of areas of how this space has to evolve. And it's a number of reasons as to why that is the case. But I do think that they need to be definitely a vocal player, but start to push towards more of that joint government-private partnership in particular. When we look at broader government, there also has to be the recognition that this is not nirvana. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. In particular, it doesn't matter how good your algorithms are as it relates to facial recognition. It's not going to solve the problems with identity. Why? Because we still have things that are fundamentally broken, right? I pick on Real ID all the time. It's because it's predicated on the fact that I have a social security card and I have a birth certificate. Well, a lot of the population today cannot get those things, or they've been damaged, and the processes that we have in place to restore them are terrible. And so when we look at things and then we say that we're just going to do biometric matches on an ID that exists where you have a face captured and the person can't even get their document from an ID standpoint, you're just further leaving people out of the process. And so I would say government-wide, there also has to be this recognition that we keep jumping to this, potential for an 80% solution, I would say even 70%. Solution at this point in time, but it's really, we need to take a step back, really get back to the root cause of like what's creating a number of these issues and start to build from there, and then do that with a public-private focus.
Thanks. I know one of the things that out of Washington that's emerged is some folks insisting, well, we shouldn't use this, but there should be instead we'll send everybody to a video chat where somebody can look at them in person. And here's another loaded question, but as we're relying on those sorts of tools, has the emergence of biased AI and face recognition that's not going to necessarily work well for everybody mean that humans have stopped being biased? Who might be, say, running those video chats and think that a certain group all looks the same to them?
No, like people in and of bias exists with human society, right? And humans are the reason why bias exists in algorithms. That are present today. I think there has to be that recognition up front. The advent of things like, or the incorporation of things like video chats into the process, yes, potentially a pathway, one that can be easily exploited in a number of ways to falsely approve someone through the process. And then again, getting back to equity issues, folks who just don't have the ability to maintain those types of connections for long periods of time, right? I don't have a smartphone or device that allows me to set up a video chat. I don't have access to a computer that allows me to do it. I have to use my local library, community center, et cetera, right? Or I don't even have access to that because of transportation issues in my work cycle. And so again, we have to really start to call things out in that, yes, these things continue to get vocalized as potential options to improve things. Really what it's putting is a Band-Aid on I would say deep-seated issues that exist within the ecosystem. And I think with a number of the folks in this room today, folks here at the conference in particular, and then just looking at government broadly, they have the opportunity to define a new way of doing what is done, or how we prove who individuals are, how do we identify them. And so it really just takes the recognition I have a problem, and then from there, let's start building towards a better future. Of course, I'll try to be an internal optimist.
Well, this is maybe a crazy idea. So everybody know pen test, right? I mean, like penetration testing, security testing, people in the room out will tell you that. But why can't we do a diversity pen testing? Try to subject your system and your program with the lenses and perspective of who you're gonna exclude. And from there, work backwards. I would say we haven't done it. There's no standard for it, and there's no approach to it. And we would talk about what NIST can do. It's probably set up those kind of framework and guidance to help organizations to do different kind of pen testing with the lenses of exclusion. Yeah,
this actually leads into my next question, which is, where are there things that government or industry could take more concrete steps to actually get better science on this or better answers. And just talking with folks over the last few months, it's been everything from saying, look, NIST tests over 300 algorithms. Some of them are actually accurate and equitable. Do they need to come up with their version of the magic quadrant? And basically, as they map them all, put a circle around it and have agencies say, you can only use those and don't use these ones that have issues, which then, of course, challenges everybody in industry to move there. Should there be testing? I know GSA has been exploring, the General Services Administration. Can they line up some of the better solutions that are used in remote identity proofing that have a biometric element and actually do meaningful testing? I wish Stephanie was here to talk about that, because she's got...
Let's channel the inner Stephanie in
all
all of us.
Yeah, so what are the good ideas here? What are the, how do we sort of get out of this bind where everybody's just assuming this is all rotten and, start to potentially rebuild trust and, focus on, what I would say, more responsible applications of the technology?
So having the opportunity and to work with Stephanie on some of the working group on FIDO Alliance, she would say that she had helped written several certification testing for biometric component, and I think start requiring in certain performance testing, right? Either so we did one for there was one for liveness. But we should have one for the failure rate and pass rate, and make those not just self-attest or referring to NIST, but having that more as an intentional approach to get your product certified to a certain performance standard. That would be what I think Stephanie would say, because she spent a lot of time in writing those certification requirements.
Jordan, any perspectives on different approaches?
Yeah, I would just add on to that and just agree wholeheartedly in that we just kind of have to shift from this compliance mindset that we still have with a number of these items, right? Am I compliant with this standard that's been put out with an algorithm, and instead push for the measures that need to exist, and then just go deeper in making sure that we can evaluate, and I would say in some cases you should do it transparently, evaluate performance of the algorithms that exist for various organizations, companies, et cetera, against common criteria that could be set. I think NIST could play a role there. I think, again, it could be a public-private partnership. Doesn't have to necessarily be all on the government to do that. But by building that and making that transparent, then you have kind of your answer as to whether or not something is inherently biased, or whether or not there's still issues with it that need to be worked out. And then, you can even have plans of attack of how do you work through those situations where it doesn't necessarily include everyone in the population, right? Because there's always going to be some type of issue in technology. The question is are we starting to do things to minimize the scope of the issues in particular, and are we getting better incrementally over time?
I want to ask a question based more on the bias argument itself. So I've had a personal concern as somebody who really worries about things like the surveillance applications, that this gets to a point you made, which was NIST last did their testing in 2019, and just 3 years later, industries, a lot has changed. And I've made this point actually to some of my friends in the activist community, that if the only thing you're charging forward on is bias, the AI is getting so good that in a few years, you might have a whole bunch of algorithms that are frighteningly accurate for every type of human on this earth. IDEMI, I know, has been an early pioneer in face recognition systems. How far away do you think we are from that point where some of the the folks who have been pushing for broader use of face just say, well, now everything's accurate and equitable, so now that we don't have bias concerns, we can use this everywhere?
It's a loaded question.
Sorry, I have a lot of loaded questions. I got opinions. So.
There's no perfect algorithm, even with AI. You look at the accuracy; it's amazing. Some of with the break data set, the last one that the DHS just did in the biometric rally, we see for the first time in facial recognition 100%. Well, out of the 601 volunteers in the African American populations, 100% accuracy rate. Small data set in a very specific use case environment. So we are getting there, but it's also a combination of acquisition device improvement and algorithm improvement. Regardless how accurate the algorithm will be, I think it does not exclude the need having a governance framework. you're gonna always going to have a policy around what it's used for, and you're gonna use it for that purpose only, enforce it, educate, and mitigate. You can't get rid of that. That governance framework needs to have. If it does require legislation to empower agency to implement, so be it. But regardless how accurate the algorithm is gonna be, I don't see that from, we need it. We need that guardrail to help us to stay on track.
Yeah, no, and I think that's one of the things I wanted to ask is, how do we have broader policy discussions around, if this technology is frighteningly accurate, how do we use it? And are there places we say we shouldn't, and other places where it's safe to use?
Yeah, I mean, so to close out the first point, I would also add that, with a lot of testing, there's also controlled conditions for that. So we also have to recognize that, algorithms necessarily won't perform under the same conditions depending on what is available to the end user. So we also have to get more human-centered and talking about the use cases of which it would be deployed in order to make that type of discussion. When it comes to the policy framework, there's been a lot of discussion and debate. I know that there's laws that have been introduced related to what we could potentially do in this space, laws to reject, laws to approve, move forward, et cetera. I think, with all of them, the common thread that continues to run through it, and it goes back to one of the earlier points that was raised, education is key and paramount, and it also means that we have to come with kind of almost a unified voice in terms of how we're approaching it from an industry standpoint, because one company or one group may go up there and have a discussion with them, another company will follow very quickly thereafter, and they may give conflicting views, and it's hard to tell really what the truth is from those policy officials. And so if they're looking to discern and make broad generalized policy that can be applied, it's important that we also do the education necessary internal to get to the same type of language and approach and kind of common rules of the road and how we're going to operate when talking about this, so that way we can actually make progress as it relates to the policy landscape.
I had one last question. I want to throw it open.
Can I say something we shouldn't use for? Number one, I think in certain situation, consent, right? I think and choice. If you look at some of the prior and less successful facial recognition deployment or pushback we see is the intentional request for consent, and for user to say, yes, I do I participate in this because it will get me X, right? So the consent needs to be there. When there's no consent, there should be probable cause. There should be a legislation framework statute why this biometric is being used. So consent, for me, that's number one. That if there's no consent and the service is provided, I think collectively as an industry, we should not condone it and we should not tolerate it. And we should not reward that kind of business model. I think that's everybody has a role to play here to incentivize the right behavior and disincentivize the, I would say, unwelcome or disrespectful to the human rights kind of business model.
Thanks. So the last question I wanted to ask, which is, when everything came out with the IRS, one of the things that they and their vendor pointed out was, well, this kind of says we pretty much have to use this to do remote identity proofing at IL2. And I don't think it's exactly a state secret to say that one of the reasons NIST has not yet published the draft of Special Publication 863-4, the revised digital identity guidelines, is they've been asked to look at, are there ways you can actually get to IL2 remotely without a biometric? So wanted to ask each of you that, do we actually need to rely on things like selfie matches and face biometrics to get to IL2? Are there other ways with other technologies that are emerging out there that we might have alternative paths for Americans that don't rely on that one element that's become so controversial?
Yes. Can I just say yes? Definitely, I would say it would be delusional from a company to say that facial is it, right? It's gonna always a new technology coming around the corner that can be a good substitute or hopefully a better substitute to what we have. I would say that maybe a combination of different things to authenticate to be as good as the facial match in IL2, and I think that's, I do think we need to give, wherever the draft we provide, we need to give the technology space the options to meet that level. Would that be? I'm pretty confident, I'm sure the creativity on the floor, on the exhibition floor will come up with something.
Jordan, perspectives? I know Socure's had some thoughts here.
Tons, and I'm going to try not to make it a pitch. But what I'll say is, I'll look at it from a different perspective. As currently written and defined by NIST IL2, no. Does it need to change overall, and we stop pretending that that is the kind of the way in which you prove who someone is? Yes. And so I would say that it would even go further and point to the fact that you can, with great degrees of accuracy, verify who someone is using the technology that is available to them without having to use biometrics. And you can do this for a number of use cases, both point of sale, both online, both offline in particular. And you can do that using, again, the devices or what they have accessible to them. You can do it based on where they're located and other things that are possible. Now, does that get to a question of, well, is it perfect? No. Because again, nothing is perfect. It has to be managed on a risk spectrum, and so there would be a recognition at that point that there is risk inherently in anything that was being rolled out, and we would start to take steps to manage around risk versus trying to manage around a biometric, and that's how I would recommend if they were to go looking at it. That's how they should try to approach it.
Thanks. We've got a few minutes for questions. Anybody have questions that they wanted to ask? Of course. Hello, Lorraine. And we don't have a mic, but we can just share the mic.
So for those who don't know me, I'm Lorraine Auld with MITRE. So I support many government agencies in this area of identity proofing. And I've received this same question, and I'm glad you asked this, Jeremy, because I was going to ask that same question. So if it's okay, I'd like to provide a comment to that question. In my mind, in accordance to NIST, there is a need for the face, but that's only one aspect of it. It's building upon that as well as all the other identity proofing steps, including providing identity documentation. But I still think, regardless of where NIST goes, I think face does have a play in it in terms of one specific piece, and that is possession. How do I know it's me that's in control of that device? And really, the only way that we have today is with that face. Yes, you could do geolocation, device analytics, which is key, user behavior. All those things play a critical role in that. But without that face, I really don't know. I'm in possession of that device. So that was something I was going to make a comment about.
I'm happy to be a runner too. But the only thing I would add to that though is that things that were proven as part of like unemployment insurance fraud, a number of things, is that even that falls flat in terms of how we have biometrics rolled out today. There are a number of folks with just basic masks that were able to break a number of the processes that we had in place. Even those who were accurately who they were, who presented their face, could not even prove possession because of the fact that the way algorithms were set up and deployed, lighting conditions, the technology that was available to them. So I understand why NIST put the parameters that they put in place up front, but again, we have to start looking at it from a perspective of risk, because ultimately you are going to leave someone out if we believe that face is actually the answer to everything.
It's not the answer to everything. It's one component, right? And it's exactly what you said.
Yeah.
So, I guess, hey everybody. I'll try to talk it like I will get into a question, but I did a talk about this last year. And one thing I will say is that the article you had about the gentleman who got arrested over in New York, the problem behind all of this is the article talks about, okay, he was wrongly arrested. That's not the end of the story. Once he actually got his record cleared and they knew it wasn't him, it was another year and a half of fighting to get it off of his record for a young gentleman who didn't really have the money for that. And so now his entire year of his life has been thrown in the trash as he's fighting to correct a mistake that somebody else made. So when I look at this, it is important that we have to look at that, and it can't be trusted. So my question is, it can't be trusted because of how it's used, right? And you're gonna get that from a lot of marginalized communities. We have no reason whatsoever to trust anything that the government does. So with that, that's the reality, that's where we're at. So the question I have is, as we're having this debate and conversation, I've loved all of it, right? All of us here mostly are in the tech industry, right? For the most part, we followed every single word you said. We know what NIST is, we know what all these things are. The people this affects have no clue. If they were in this room, none of the language we just said they would understand. So are we the right champion to actually be doing this? Because we all work for companies, right? You work for a company, you work for a company. So well, as we see this, do you think there's like should there be some other body, right, that's championing for the actual users? Because your guys' products get sold to other companies, which then go, so you don't even directly touch your end user. So are we really the ones to be in the best position to help them, or should there be like some other body like that represents the actual people?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, one of the things I've tried to do is build some relationships with folks in the activist community who have been out there leading the charge on, a lot of this, to have this discussion around the point I raised before, for example, of what happens when we don't have bias in a few years because the AI is so good, and how do we shift the conversation to something more productive? I have found, it's hard to say the activist community is one community, but there are challenges in some cases in that, so I will not say the organization, but it's one that everybody knows that leads the charge on a lot of this. Like, they're mad at Apple for Face ID. Because they will tell you, of course, it's great for security and privacy and protecting users, but it normalizes the use of face biometrics. And every time we do that, it takes us down a slippery slope to this, which is where things are going to go. So likewise, they can acknowledge privately over a beer that like what CBP is doing for border entry with face has actually been designed thoughtfully and responsible, but they're going to throw stuff at it publicly all the time that they can. Because they're worried it leads us down that slippery slope of like the clear view vision of surveillance. And so I think, to your point, I respect where they're coming from. At least, I understand them even if I don't agree with it. But I think they're ultimately doing a disservice to people who are going to be vulnerable and be impacted, because if you say no to everything, then you're not actually coming up with responsible ways to use the technology, and then you start to get ignored in the conversation. And so I think that's actually missing from this discussion right now is beyond industry or advocates, at least the current crop of advocates, how can you get some others who might be more pragmatic or trustworthy? So it's a great concern. Thanks for noting it.
To answer your question, I think it's not one. It's a team sport. Everyone needs to take a role, take a part. Are we missing some component in this ecosystem to push this further so this person get help, right, to recover his innocence and go to his right to have a normal life? Yes. I think the infrastructure, it takes a village to do this right. And while we may not be the one impacting this person, we provide a solution system to the law enforcement agencies, right? So as a vendor, we have to be vocal and amplify the need to make sure when they deploy a program, they have policy in place, they have training in place, and we push that and make training available to ensure that the system is properly used. So yes, when the agent, we will also tell the agency, you gotta start comparing vendors. Don't just compare the tech. Compare what the vendor is doing beyond the tech, right? Policy, training, advocacy, involvement in the industry, and so forth. So it's not just one trick pony, right? Like Jamie said, some of the vendors being evaluated by NIST, some are students, and they may make their algorithm free on open source in GitHub. Then what? So it's up to the agency to come up with a criteria who you want to use beyond just the accuracy of the tech.
The only thing I would add to that is, right now we don't go far enough in terms of like what's available today in terms of redress recovery, exactly what that individual needed in order to come back from it. Right, there was like a notional attempt to do some stuff, but it's still a long, elongated process if you were a victim of identity theft, or not even if you had this circumstance in particular. I would say that when I talk about public-private partnership, and remember, formerly was in government, I actually do believe that public is the actual key there in working with private. So it's not just government officials, but it also should be forums in which you're actually hearing the public and designing based on that. And in order to help make the impact and just really putting everything from the lens of what is the impact to the end user ultimately, and what are they saying, what can they not do. So I agree completely that I agree in the premise that they need to be a part of the conversation. The technology community cannot solve this independently, but I also think that the technology community has the ability to elevate and spread out the message in a way that an individual by themselves could not do. Let's see, I think you made that.
And by the way, I know it is lunchtime now, but since folks want to keep talking, I'm happy to. I'm not that hungry, so we can have. I think we can have the room.
Sure. So I'll be quick, and I have one comment about what she spoke about and what she spoke about some of the governance thing. Coming as a Palestinian American whose family subjected to involuntary submission of their biometrics to train some of these models that these vendors are using to pitch to all these companies and governmental entities, I find this whole technology problematic. As a hypocrite, my company uses some of this technology to authenticate identity. Yeah, so I mean, if I had my way, I'd throw this whole tech in the dumpster, but it's a necessary evil at this point. My question, and if you could answer this slightly, I know we have a lot more and I don't want to monopolize, is that with deep fakes and with even simplified low-tech ways to spoof this, what we've seen is an increase of bad actors be able to circumvent facial recognition, be it with injecting images into browser-based authentication tools, or some of the newer bleeding edge stuff is with some of the deep fake where it's live, and with at least I know I have enough images online, publicly accessible that people could generate a live model to beat most of these systems that are in use. What is the industry and some of these models, if you maybe can educate us on, what are they doing to help try to, if they can, stop that, that type of fraud?
This is where we're really missing Stephanie, because she's like maybe the best researcher in the world on this topic. But you all can jump in, because.
I mean, yeah, I can talk at a high level, right? Like that is something that is like top of mind for us in particular. I know that we were evaluating, and actually we even did something internally where, and see, my Socurians are here, they may smack me. But anyway, it's more of we actually did a deep fake of our CEO in order to pull up and basically show like how far it's coming in particular. It's something that we're basically evaluating all the vectors or methods that are being used in order to break the system, in order to help try and improve the system. So I think you said pen test earlier, but we're trying to do that from more of a fraudster's standpoint, and then constantly evaluating that. Like that type of rigorous testing and analysis is what has to go into making improvements to the technology overall, and how you're able to identify the nuances in face, how it's constructed, whether the video, there's choppy images in particular, in order to help discern some of those items. Again, not perfect, a lot of work needs to be done there, but like that's the type of stuff that we're engaged with at least.
So I would see it as a balancing act, because more things you put in to fight the spoofing, the more friction you can get on the user side. So it's this like spectrum of balance you need to get, because make it too difficult, you're doing exclusion. You make it friction for your users, and meaning it is too difficult to use, people is not going to use it, meaning the system will be less secure. So it's a balancing act. But yes, to talk about deepfakes, there are working group and technology out there trying to do what we call deepfake detections. There are different consortium projects going on. Lauren can talk more about. There's some project that we are involved in Europe to do. Actually, it's a quite a cool way. It's like you have university and industry. One is doing the detection, one is doing the attack, and we kind of attack each other and do research. So it's a sort of a collaboration going on to fight that. And then we do measurement. So I'm hoping that some of the results may get published soon, but has been the works. So there are some, I would call active spoofing, anti-spoofing method and passive liveness methods. I think it's going to be a combination of both in order to fight those. When you say active spoofing, anti-spoofing method is that instead of just a live video, you're gonna have to sort of different vendors do it different ways, we come up with a way where we actually have to instruct you randomly doing certain things, and so that not a spoofing video, deepfake video can just do it. However, it does create ADA issues. What if you're sight impaired? How are you gonna do that? So at some point, you're gonna have to come up with what we call multi-point approach. It's not just gonna be just video, facial recognition based, maybe you're gonna have to rely on secondary biometrics, behavioral biometrics. It's a combination of all that to deal with the spoofing issue while not making it too difficult for the people to use. And I do agree with you if your data got used, monetized without your consent, it's definitely a problem. I do not agree with that.
It can also get to past an arrest. It can get to targeted killings, which happened toward my homeland. So, what happens when they drone bomb the wrong person?
Chris Chamberlain, Department of Homeland Security, Office of Biometric Identity Management. I work with Stephanie, and I hope to maybe close a couple gaps right now. Great opportunity for that. DHS funds CITER. We do a lot of work on these topics. Not face, but also iris and many biometrics. And we are very concerned about the diversity and inclusion topic. I should note that DHS does not have the data values of race or ethnicity standardized across all the DHS systems. We're working to close that. Second topic, NIST. DHS OBIM funds NIST to help with the FRVT tests. Go look up the NIST website. There's not just the FRVT report on the vendor performance. There's a range of other reports. And we're also working with them on 19794 Part 5 for face quality. Big deal. Third point, we recently partnered with the Department of Justice to fund a National Academy of Sciences study on facial recognition. That's getting kicked off. You'll be able to participate in public sessions with that. So those are a bunch of good things that are happening. Yeah. Yeah.
But Teresa mentioned earlier about the DHS Maryland study and how it's so highly accurate. How is that?
So the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology has a Maryland test facility where they hire people that these study subjects opt in to participate in studies. And they walk through and faces are collected and fingerprints and iris and a whole bunch of other stuff is collected, and they do what are called biometric rallies. And if you go to the DHS website, you can learn all about these various biometric rallies that are very, very helpful. But they are in a very controlled situation with controlled groups. So, but we were very worried about facial recognition, especially the AI part. And it sounds like you're willing to share the IDEMIA data sets that are used in your AI algorithms, maybe? Would that be something we could ask about, maybe, separately? Because that's probably coming.
You want to answer that one?
You want to intervene as a moderator there to say next question? Or?
I like Chris' question. I like Chris.
All right.
Thank you, Chris. No, I think what NIST should be doing is to, with some of the extra money they get, actually in their funding bills, is to work on some of these special data set, the defect data set, the detection data set, so that help the entire industry to do better. But what IDEMIA use, of course, it's our secret sauce, but we also use the data set that are legally obtained and lawfully obtained.
All right, I'm gonna ask a really obnoxious question.
Sure.
I'm sorry, not really.
Sorry, not sorry.
Even for the gentleman at the DHS, right? So this is for Jordan's, for Teresa. For all the things that your teams that are working on this, how many of those people look like you?
How many people? So the head of my AI research data unit, it's a woman. I have it's one of the few groups that have parity in terms of women and men. People that looks like me, actually quite a bit, because actually we do have a data unit in India. We also have a data research unit in Morocco, and then we have a data research unit in France. And that's one of the reasons since 2018. So the gentleman on minor in list would say that NIST actually called us out for being one of the first to be tackling the fairness issue, and actually in some of the scientific conferences to explain how we are achieving the balancing of mitigating the demographic variations. And that's what we got called out in the NIST report, because we were the first one to talk about and share in a public conference. So that's why I think Chris is nudging me, because we kind of start bragging about it since 2018. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, there's a number of diverse faces within our company in particular. I'll tell you that 25% of our headcount as a company, right now we're over 500, close to 600 individuals, are all data scientists. These data scientists are the ones that work on it, and they, every spectrum under the sun. And a lot of them actually don't even come to the industry or come to us from identity. They come from outside of identity, because they're able to provide a different perspective in terms of how do you try to solve these types of problems in particular. But we actually make it a point to solve with diverse teams. So we have multiple perspectives. And of course, you also have folks like me that just like to throw rocks at things.
That's the answer, David, to your question. Is across industry probably not nearly enough?
It's just, people have to be in the room to, if we're all in the room and we all like football, right? We're all gonna agree. And then somebody comes in that likes tennis, it's totally different. So if there's not enough people in those rooms, when the research has happened, when all these things are, you're not gonna know, right? So if you didn't grow up and the first, smartphone you ever saw was until 25, you're not gonna know that most people under the age of 18 in some communities aren't gonna have smartphones. Even though we all believe everybody's got an iPhone, it's not true. But if you didn't grow up in that, you're not gonna know, because you're just gonna be like, well, everybody had an iPhone when I was a kid, so then everybody has an iPhone. That's not the case, right? So it's those type of things and conversations that come up when that is being done that forces then you guys to go, well, let's look at this, let's look at this data set, which I think is ultimately one of the things that will help with a lot of this. We start looking at other data sets and perspectives to help with this. All right, I'm shut up now.
You're very passionate about it. It's great. It's great. I will tell you, 20 years ago, when I just started in this industry, one of my sponsors, we walked the show for booth, because he said to me, you are Asian and woman, your fingerprint's gonna break our comparator system. So let's go and visit every single comparator booth and try the system out, see which one will fail you. And it did fail. But it's very early on, we know that biometrics work with certain better population than the other. So very, very early on, I said, I'm a very bad demo model, because I can break even our own system, right? And it was kind of funny. That's how I got into this space, because I feel special. I can break my competitor demo system. It's awesome.
I'm going to say we'll do last question, because people might actually want to eat lunch at some point. We're 20 minutes over, but this is great.
Hi. So my question is, all this AI or machine learning, everything is like subject to a little failure when it comes to false positive or true negative, right? Those are like, especially with facial recognition, we can say, this is my face, or this is not my face. I can say that. And why is there is no human intervention, or the relying party is not establishing any policy when I say, okay, it's not me, or it is me? When I say an objection for the facial recognition answer, why is it not taken into account? For example, in the arrest case, a policeman went and arrested. So when he says no, and a person seeing the other person, he can identify it, right? So why it happens? And when you say minority, we cannot do the face recognition 100% or 99.9%. I'm from India. It's the most populated country, and China. It's all in Asia. So it's like we have lot of public data. Even if you take like a movie clips, that gives you a lot of data to machine learn things. So why there is a failure?
So in the case of the gentleman there, what's happening? There was human intervention. There was, police agency does not just say the machine speed up a match and say, oh, that's it, and you go arrest the person. No, it doesn't happen that way. There was human intervention. There was human confirming there's a match before you do the next step to issue the arrest. What happened there is because I would say the user training was lacking. At the end, that what's public, so full disclosure, that was not IDEMIA customer, so I can only comment based on what I know in the public knowledge. What transpires that and they admit it's the lack of the person, human, making that determination lack training. There are tons of forensic face comparison training out there available, and that department did not really have it. All they got is how to use the system, not understanding the science of forensic face comparison. So that's where I would say failure number one. Not the system. The system did a false rank candidate list, but then the human confirmation also failed. Lack of that, I would say, is expert training. And then you ask, why can't we supplement AI matching with human confirmation? Great question. I think there is. But it's the cost in operating, right? At what point you want a human intervention, because it means time, right? Do you want the person wait for 8 hours to get the resolutions, or in seconds? And I would say that's why you need certain automation first, and then when you have the gray zone, that critical zone, then you need expert. When you say human intervention, I don't call that human intervention because, like Jordan said, we're all human, we all make mistakes, we have all our biases. Face comparison is an expert skills. You think that you can compare people, I will give you tons of examples. It's difficult to compare. You need an expert training to really do face comparison, not just a help desk person to do it. Yes, you should. In some cases, like you say, risk analysis and baseline, in your process, if you feel like you need expert validation, make sure you do have expert make those determinations, not just human. Human's not enough.
I think it's a great point. I mean, one of the, early in my career, I learned a lot about the forensic side of fingerprints. And, I learned it's not just like you see in the movies where, we got a hit and we go get the person. It's, we got a hit, and now we're going to have a specially trained latent print examiner who's going to look on giant screens at the two fingerprints and see if they can confirm what the algorithm found, that there's actually a match. And then, only then, do you actually have something law enforcement can act on. I'm pretty sure with these Clearview cases in New Jersey, in Detroit, that didn't happen. It was the cops saying, whoop, we got a match, and just swooping in. And so it's, there's no reason we should be having the machines make all the decisions here. But so much of this also comes to, if we're getting this technology into, say, law enforcement's hands. To be clear, I'm trying to focus on the ID verification use cases, but let's have that discussion where it's being misused other places. There's no reason that should ever happen without somebody actually who's trained confirming that there's a match before you go in with that sort of thing. All right, thanks everybody. This has been a great session. Thanks for sticking around for extra time, and let's get some lunch. Thank you.